I'll sit down beside the programmer, let the programmer drive, and I'll ask questions. What happens if you do this? What if you do this? And there's a lot of benefits to doing something like this besides the fast feedback, because it's still in development. So the programmer can fix any bugs we find. In fact, sometimes you can pair with them right there and then and fix them immediately, which means they don't have to go in a defect tracking system. They don't have to even think about being recorded because we fix them as we've done it right there and then. Saves a lot of time. So we have that, they check in their code. We then can do all our exploratory testing that we want to do. Sometimes you can take that and put it on your machine and test it. Maybe it goes to a test environment, wherever you can do that exploratory testing. Whatever else you need to do, maybe security testing, depends. But whatever is required for the definition of done. So now we have our story almost complete. Just one more step. And that's for the product owner, product manager, whoever, whatever you call them, is to run their acceptance tests, right? I like hands-on testing. Does it do what I thought it should do? And then you get the big check mark and accepted, hopefully, right? And that's that cycle, like acceptance test driven cycle. The most important thing is not the tooling. It is not the automation. It is the discussion to get you there. The automation and the tooling, that becomes a side effect. It just helps, right? It is not the goal. So I want you to think a little bit. I want you to think about this, an exercise. So the story, a potential speaker. So we've already decided that they can withdraw their submitted talk. A potential speaker withdraws a submitted talk. I want you to take probably 90 seconds. Think about what questions you might ask. Would states of the talk help, right? What examples can you think of? What tests might prove that story acceptance? So I said 2 minutes, I think I'll do 90 seconds. So jot down your ideas, or maybe better yet, put them in the chat if you're brave. Let's see what you come up with. All right, excellent. Those are some great questions, I love that. Some I hadn't even thought about before, right? So when we're coding and when we're trying to figure out what it's going to be, if I'm just going to kind of go back up to some of these questions. So should the information be completely removed or just kind of archived for another time? Should the speaker get notified? These are really good questions. Why did you withdraw? That might be something we care about. But it might be personal and we don't really care. Maybe we just have something to say, it's personal or something else. Maybe we do that manually and ask them by an email. But there's, I'm just gonna scroll through some of them. Things like, is the program updated? If we withdraw a thing, do we have to do something else? Are there refunds? Depends if they had to pay in the first place, but yes. Would you be willing to speak? So these are a lot of questions that happen as a follow-up if you want to do it as well. There's some really good questions. If we were programming, a question like, and so these are, it's important to ask questions. That first quote that I had, right? So this question, was the speaker not confident with what he was going to speak about? So this comes back into the why he's withdrawing. Would we care about that if we were programming a submission? We might not care about the whys as we're programming it. It's important for the programming committee to maybe to know this, but not from a coding standpoint, right? And so we need to think about, but by asking the question, somebody has to think about whether or not there's a follow-up to that. So even if we ask that, it's a good question to be getting people thinking. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that makes people think. And a lot of times we just go into a story without actually considering a lot of these different options. So these are great. Now, so some of the things I thought about was the state of the talk. So I submit it. It's a new submission. Can I draw a state diagram to help me think about what it might be? What would the next state be, right? It's been reviewed, because I didn't say whether it has been accepted or not. They've just submitted it. Does it matter when we withdraw? If it's this new submission, probably we don't care. We haven't even looked at it. Delete or something, I don't know. If it's already been reviewed, maybe we can do something like reject it. If it's already been reviewed and has a pending acceptance on it, how do we handle that? If it's already reviewed, or if it's been rejected, I guess it's easy to withdraw. If it's already been reviewed and accepted. But then some of your questions, which I hadn't really gotten that far, was it's already been reviewed, it's accepted, and it's in the program. Completely different. How do we handle these different things, right? So those are all questions. Things like state diagrams can help us to think of those different scenarios. When we go to think about the examples, that's when we want to really start thinking about details, right? And so we want to think about, how are we going to do that? How might we automate this if we were going to make automated tests, right? So we want to be thinking about ways to show it, and ways to think about it. So you can just put examples in I find examples in, if I can show them in a tabular format like that, then I can see them. But you can do examples in pictures, you can do examples most any way that you can think of. When you have concrete examples, then you will think of more. You will think of more. For example, the current state, it's already been in the program. That will have a completely different response than if it's only in the submissions system. All right, so I want to leave that kind of behind for a second. I want to talk about the quadrants, because this is a good way to talk about different kinds of testing when we're thinking about what kinds of tests. So the quadrants are, there are 4 different quadrants, and the left-hand side is guiding development, the right-hand side is critiquing the product. The top is business-facing, which means the tests are in a language that the business would understand, and the bottom half is technology-facing. The business would care about the results, but don't really probably care about the tests themselves. So when we were talking about acceptance test-driven development, we were talking about, and Lisa, by the way, I noticed that we don't have numbers on this. The bottom left is usually quadrant 1. This top left is quadrant 2 usually, just for ease of use. But this quadrant 2, these examples, these are where we start that acceptance test-driven development cycle, by asking for examples, by perhaps using simulations or prototypes to help us, right? We go down into the unit tests, and that's that center part of it as we, at the coding level. So it's not in any particular order. The third quadrant, which is this business facing the critique, is our exploratory testing, things like user acceptance testing. And the 4th quadrant is the technology facing that critique the product. And those are the quality attributes like performance, load, those sorts of things. What the quadrants are good for, or what I find them the most useful, is as a thinking tool. having the conversations about what kinds of tests we do, and what is the purpose. So the top left, that purpose is to help us guide development and to get a shared understanding of what we are going to be doing, right? So having this conversation with a team, these examples on this quadrant is only that. They're examples. So in your team, go back and have that conversation, that list you made at the very beginning. What else are you missing? The rest of the team can help you fill that in, and then try to figure out where they are in the quadrants, right? It's a way to visualize the type of testing that the team needs to do, and makes it way easier to talk about when you can see it. Now, I can take this model with the tests, and I can go talk to pretty much anybody in the organization. I don't know if we have any executives or management people here, but I can take the quadrants from any team and use that to go talk about, hey, this is why we need to do this, right? It gives you a way to have a common vocabulary. Now, once teams have that conversation, then they can see how they contribute to done. So if I define story done as everything in the left-hand side, everything that's guiding development has to be completed for story done. Maybe the exploratory testing has to be completed for story done. But maybe the rest of it, not necessarily, except if we have to put instrument the code for the monitoring observability, right? We might have to think about that over in quadrant 1 tests, right? So we may or may not do some of those quality attribute testing. As part of story done. It might make more sense as part of feature done, right? So feature done might include all of quadrants 1s, 2s, and 3 kind of thing, the first 3, and should probably include quadrant 4. But maybe there's something like the stress tests we really can't do until a little bit later. But define that, have the conversation. What goes into story done? What goes into feature done? One of my pet peeves is when I talk to a team and they say, story done can't happen until it's in production. Well, unless you're doing continuous deployment, that means that story done might never be done. It might be sitting there as incomplete. So define story done, define feature done, and really think carefully about what tests make that up. All right, so I said checking was part of that. So checking is probably the most boring thing about testing, making sure the product does what it is supposed to do. This is why we want to automate it. That automation becomes your regression suite, right? Because I've had one person in all my years, because I asked the question lots, who likes to do manual regression testing? I've had one person say yes. But the rest, it's boring, it's error prone. As human beings, we can't do the same thing over and over again. So we will make changes, we will assume things work. So checking to make sure the product does what it's supposed to do or does what it did yesterday, let's automate that. I'm sure that most of you, if not all, have seen some version of the pyramid. There. Oh, I just found a bug in this. I took this from another slide. This is a bug, and it's a huge bug. Can anybody spot it? Lisa, do you know what the bug is? the title. I took this slide from a different presentation, an old one, and it's should not be the Agile testing pyramid. It should say the automation testing pyramid. It's an automation. It is not all types of testing, purely automation. I am chagrined. But anyhow, this model is also a thinking model. It is not perfect, but when we start having conversations with our team, so one of my favorite exercises to do is sit with the team, especially on a new feature or something we're not sure on, is say, hey, let's draw a big pyramid. What kinds of tests do we have to do? What kind of automation are we going to have? This might be part of that conversation I have with the programmer to say, what can we automate? What level should we do it at? What should be included in unit tests? Because I don't want to duplicate them at the API level. Let's be smart. And so having models like this will allow you to have those conversations. And over time, you don't need the picture, but it's a great place to start, right? So those unit tests, if we really think about them as the base of our regression suite, because they're fast feedback, but they're not enough, right? So that's why we start testing business rules at the API layer, especially if we want to make them visible to the customer, right? That's what that API layer would be for, because the tools make it visible. And then the top of the pyramid, the workflow tests, those are the most brittle because they're testing the biggest chunks. So they're brittle, they're hard to maintain. So we want the minimum amount that we can possibly have at that top of that pyramid, hence the pyramid. We want to push the tests lower if we can, but there might be reasons why we have them, right? And we don't want to have a lot of duplication. It also comes back and starts to think about those different levels as well. So maybe we only automate this at the workflow, at the feature level, because that's when all the UI is done. The automation at the story level, that's at the API layer, because the user interface can change all at once as long as our calls and our methods are stable. And then of course, those unit tests are done by the programmer as they're coding, so it's fast feedback. So we really want to be thinking about that. The last part I want to talk about is the investigative kind of testing. This is where testers get really excited because they can use all of their critical thinking skills. Exploratory testing, I won't go into details too much about it. I really recommend people, if they want to know more, buy Elizabeth Hendrickson's book, Explore It. It's on my final slide, resources. But the exploratory testing is finding the unknowns. All these other tests that we've done before are about things we thought about. But exploratory tests help you find those surprises, those interactions that we had not possibly thought about. And they happen all the time. They just do. Ooh, I didn't know it would look like that. That's kind of not good, right? The other part of investigation is the quality attributes. So quality attributes could be things like stress testing. How much load can we put on it before it breaks? Or performance testing. How fast can we go? We want it to respond in, 20 milliseconds. And so this is concentrating on the quality attributes. So we want to be thinking about that. So if we think about exploratory testing, right, there's lots of different ways to do it. I'm going to just kind of talk about a few different ways. You can explore around risks, right? Either business risks or implementation risks. quite often when I'm doing a show me with the programmer, I'll get comments like, you know, this was integrating with the legacy code and it was really hard to do that. I will create an exploratory test charter to say, I want to do a little bit more testing around that risk. The most common that I see is workflows or user journeys, because that's kind of what's natural to do. And a lot of times I see exploratory testing, especially with new people trying to do it, always focused around user journeys and workflows. Another way that I find very useful is personas, and there's quite a bit written up about it. But for example, if we go back to that conference, so if we're submitting, perhaps, what if I had a persona? We have all these, I said new submitter, existing submitter. What if I have a non-English speaking person, or it's not their first language? Could they find their way around? Is it easy for them? So we want to be thinking about those sorts of things. Where can they get help if they need existing help? Maybe they want to ask for help with their abstracts because they need reviews from an English speaking. So there's different ways to have personas, and they can be very powerful because it's not strictly on the functionality. And tours. I find tours really helpful, especially during the end game, maybe after a feature is complete, because what happens, and I encourage you, Google exploratory testing tours. You'll find lots of things, but it's based on the idea of a tourist. So you can set up different kinds of tours. What it allows you to do is come at your application from a different perspective. As people, as testers, as programmers, as domain people, we will go at and we will come into our application the same way every time. So if you have something like a tour, then you can make yourself and kind of force yourself to come at it from a different way. So I encourage you to Google and find out what it really is about. Somebody just commented in the chat under risks, things like medical devices, safety, right? Those are big risks, absolutely. Those are probably, that's a really good thing. I got to add that in there. But yes, find out what is your most important things. What are your biggest risks? The other place where we could start talking about safety is when we're talking about quality attributes. How do we investigate these different quality attributes? So on here, I see, safety is under the deployment environment. They're thinking of safety from a different perspective, might be from a medical device, right? If I have a heart monitor, I want to make sure that that's safe. If I'm flying in an airplane, how do we make sure that that's safe, right? And that really is a deployment environment kind of thing. But a lot of times, what people think about is general operational, the performance, the reliability, the security. When people talk about quality attributes, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But there's a whole piece under the deployment environment, one of them being safety. If we even think about, say, security, I would like to see that divided up more, instead of just putting it all under security. But we have things like privacy now. We have things like, it used to be just our, who's allowed in, who can see this information, right? But there's a whole lot of other stuff under security too, like, can we hack it? And I think that we tend to lump things in, and people don't understand exactly and specifically what we mean. So the conversation has to happen. And a lot of these things are not team related, but organizational related. How do you have this quality discussion at an organizational level? What is the most important thing for us as an organization, or us in this product, if we have several different product lines? Those conversations should happen and don't always happen. If they do, they don't always get down to the teams. So we really need to think about these sort of things and have that conversation. And the last one that Ellen and Mary have talked about in their deployment environment is, this is really from the developer standpoint. How do we build testability into our code? How do we make sure it can be modified? And this is getting into that refactoring piece. These are quality attributes that, how do we build our code? And a lot of times we forget about it. And I think that becomes a really important thing. As a team, as an organization, can we have these quality discussions? So somebody, Margaret Deneen, did a talk, and she was talking about quality sliders. So from a team perspective, she said what she does with their teams is she goes in and puts up all of the quality attributes that's important. They have a discussion, and then she asks everybody to do a scale, a sliding scale. How important do you think reliability is to us? And then that starts to generate that conversation. And I think that's a really great way to start the conversation. Now, if we think about, because none of us are in this, well, maybe some of us are for the fun, but most of the time we work for organizations and they're there to be competitive, right? And so these practices all help us do that. Having the continuous integration allows me to be able to test at any time. Having a good deployment environment, a good deployment pipeline with good, stable test environments allows us and enables us to test and to be able to say, hey, this is what we're testing. Here's what we're testing. Here's where we're testing. We know what to expect. It allows us to deliver often, right? But one of the things we have to think about, along with all of this thing, is how do we build this in? How do we know that we are having our testing done, that we are building quality in, that just because we can get it into production fast, is it good, right? So by having observability built in, that allows us to monitor. But if we don't have some of those base quality things in before, we're not going to delight our customers. So there will be things we miss, but by having the other things working with this, in conjunction with this, will really allow us to go faster with quality. So focus on the quality, the speed will come. If you focus on speed, the quality gets left behind. So really encourage teams to think about that. And the last slide I have, oh, it kind of looked kind of weird on the slide, is these are the practices, right? Use examples to guide development. Really think about testability. Testing is not only about testing functionality and code. It goes way beyond that, way beyond that. Testing is actually a combination of checking and exploring. But in all of those things, that asking questions is probably, I should put that in the equation, over questions. And one of my favorite questions, and I leave you with this, is the first question you should ask: how are we going to test this? And with that, these are some further readings. Explore it. It's really good. Discovery by Seb Rose and Gaspar is a really good book. They're talking about BDD. in different things. So that's there. And if you want to email me, please do. Janet at Agile Tester. My Twitter is Janet Gregory CA for Canada. And that's about it. So I will take questions. And I believe we have time for that. So I'll stop sharing so I can see people again. All right.
And yes, Janet, we have time for questions.
Excellent. All right. So you can either raise your hand and you can ask me in person, or you can put the in your chat if you're a little shy. I see Lisa, thank you, Lisa, for putting the post on quality sliders in the chat group. So the first thing I want to mention, it's not a real question. David said, regulated industries require that all testing be documented, signed off by a licensed person, and traced back to requirements. That's not actually always true. I'm not going to say it is never true. Most of the time, if you go back and look at the actual requirements, it says, show evidence that. It does not say document everything. It show evidence that. And if you're doing all of these things, and I've worked with a medical company that has proven it to be true, that they were doing, so every story that came in, they were automating, they were doing all of this. So their process itself and their artifacts, which was automation and other things, which was part of what they did, was enough evidence for the auditors. There's a fellow, his name is, it's going to escape me, who deals a lot in regulations and regulatory and agile. I'll think about it and it'll come to me right after. But he does a lot of talking. And so there's a lot of organizations that are doing regulatory without having to document all of this stuff. Oh, and Lisa put in an example as such too. Okay, so if anybody puts up their hand and wants to talk, Jerry, can you do it? Otherwise, I'll take questions from the chat. Quality metrics for agile testing from Jasmine. Metrics, such a tricky thing. The one thing that I to say is throw away bug counts. Because the only thing bug counts does is really tell you how bad your product is, not necessarily how good it is. I'm a fan of zero tolerance, which means that we fix our bugs as we go, because that's the most efficient way of doing it, the most effective way of doing it. So zero tolerance says 0 known defects escaping an iteration, right? Or escaping a story. Which means you just fix it as you go. There will be exceptions, there's always exceptions, but if you keep that low, you no longer have to measure bugs. I used to go into teams and ask how many open bugs they had, and I would get numbers like 1,000, 5,000. Now I'm going in to teams and I'm hearing numbers like 5. We have 5 open bugs, we're working on them, which is fabulous. I love it. So the one metric that I like to use is how many defects are being recorded or entered by our customers. To me, that's important, right? What I see most teams measuring is process, not the quality of the product. And those are 2 different things. Quality of the process versus quality of the product. So differentiate those 2 things for one thing. It's really a hard thing to measure. There's not a good way to measure quality of the product. Responses from your customers is probably the best. Okay, and yes, I can share the deck. It's on a recording, but I can share the deck. how do you respond? Sorry, I'll read the question. How do you respond to the concern about separation of duties, having developers write test automation? So I had so many people say segregation of duties that I went and looked it up. And the segregation of duties actually came from many years gone by when what was happening was the programmer was the only person looking at it and setting it into production. So they decided, let's get testers in. And that's where the testing team, separate testing team was born. Segregation of duties, when you look at it from the very beginning, says more than one person looking at something. So the looking, if you have two pairs of eyes, pairing would be almost okay under that. Tester, programmer, pair is definitely two pairs of eyes looking at things. That test automation that we're talking about here, having the programmer, so if I write a test, it's usually data, right? What are my inputs? This is what I expect. The test method, the test fixture, what it does is it takes those inputs and passes it through, calls the production code, compares it to the expected results and the actual result and says true or false. So that test method really doesn't do any manipulation. It doesn't do anything. The test is defined separately. So can the programmer write that? Absolutely, because the test is coming from someplace else. So even if you thought it had to be somebody else, you can separate it that way. And which I like to do, is have every single piece of code, every single test results looked at by more than one person. It's pairing. It's a wonderful thing. I like to go to somebody and say, here are my tests. Have I missed anything? When I do an exploratory test charter, taking my notes and saying, hey, would you look at these? Did I miss something? Was there something really weird here? So all of a sudden you have somebody check. Same with writing a test method. Somebody else look at it, do a peer review on it. All right. I hope that Griffin Jones, thank you, Lisa. Griffin Jones is a person who does the regulatory. And I'm guessing, yeah. Okay, sign off is a business requirement. I hate the word sign off, actually, because it makes it phased and gated. So can we put in our process enough things that we don't need to have sign off? So I use the word accepted by the product owner, right? And so it might be accepted, might mean that the story has gone all through, they've had the demo, they've done the testing, they've touched down, they've sat down and they've tested it, and it looks good. So the acceptance might mean moving that card from done to accepted or something like that. It doesn't have to be a physical sign off. Sign off is often an organizational requirement versus anything else. So I would start to ask where that comes from and why. It truly is independent of methodology, but it is usually organizational requirements. Okay. So Jerry just said when they publish the video, the slides are added to the meeting page. And Griffin Jones, can you speak to how the quality attributes can be incorporated into Scrum practice? Having all of them be part of the definition of done seems a bit onerous. As I said, understand what is the most important thing. So if security is really important, then yes, it should be part of the definition of done. But maybe only a portion of a part of story done. So however your programmers think about security and what do they have to do as part of their coding, maybe that's looked at from a peer review, right? But I like to think of the quality attributes as constraints. So there's something that we have to think about as we go forward. So performance, don't put a story in that says we have to have performance in under 2 seconds. Every page needs to respond in less than 2 seconds. Have that as a constraint so that you are building it in to the code. And then it doesn't become onerous because it's part of what you do. It's only onerous if you leave it till the very end. Right, so really think about what is story done, what is feature done, and how do you implement that? All right, so so David has put a little note in there. His thoughts about what it is, please read that. I'm not gonna read it all. There's a lot of it. It's talking about automation for regulated industries. Yeah, you can, so a lot of it, when you put in build numbers and recording, it documents it for you. It becomes part of your process, right? So he also mentions that important to have testers separate from developers. So the person who wrote it should not be the person who tests it. I agree, and only because of our human biases, not because developers can't test. It's because of our human biases. When, as a programmer, you program it to work. And it's hard to think of ways that it will not work. And so that's some of those things that asking questions and giving the test to the programmer first really helps, right? Because all of a sudden they're thinking about testing it as they go. They're building the tests in. Now, somebody asked me once, actually I've been asked a few times, if we give the tests to the developers first, will they just get lazy and only code to that? My answer every time is a good developer will not only code to that. They will also think of other things that they want to test. And they may come to you to say, hey, Janet, you need to automate this as well. A good developer will not think in the box, stay in that box. Now, the poor developers, and I've worked with a number, if I give my test to them first, it's 100 times better. The code that comes out is at least 100 times better than it was before. Makes me happy. So, but often I've seen teams that have no testers and they're perfectly fine, depending on the application they're building mostly. But I would have somebody else test their code for sure because of their biases. But it doesn't always have to be a tester. If a development group is buying or creating a tool for another developer group, they're perfectly capable of testing that. In my experience, anyhow. Okay, broader level tools, generate traceability. Yeah, so I encourage you to read those comments from in the chat because there's some really good comments there. Yes, so Lisa says, and I look at the question first and then see who put it in. One of the things about having testers or somebody else test is it gives you different perspectives. And so that's one of the reasons to have somebody else testing.
Okay, thank you.
When testing individual stories, are there general guidelines for manual and exploratory versus automated? None that I know of. I'm going to automate as many as I can, given it's a smart thing to do. If it's something that needs to run again and again and again and again, I'm going to automate it. If it's a one-time test, I'll probably do it manually. And so when I tend to use the term these days, human-centric versus manual. It just has a better ring to it for me. But exploratory testing is an approach, right? It's a very human-centric approach because it's using people versus the machine. There is no, I do not think you can automate everything. In fact, I know you can't. And there's some things that are not smart to automate, but I've never heard of any, automate 90%, have 10% exploratory testing. I don't know. I think it would really depend on your application, because some of them are very much really hard to automate. A lot of user interface stuff with, it depends. I'm a consultant. Okay. Might not say sign off. Somebody said in FINRA. So that might be very specific to them too. Regulated organizations, only a licensed person can approve a change and certify that all testing was completed to validate the requirements. I do not know what FINRA is. I don't know if that's a US thing or anything else, but I don't even know what a licensed person means. So. Lisa put Griffin Jones's Twitter handle on there, and he will be on LinkedIn. I know he is. User story mapping can be used for testing. User story mapping is a way to slice stories. I would suggest you look up, and I think it's in my slide deck, example mapping. By Matt Wynn. It's a way to help you ask questions, to understand, do you understand the business rules? Do you have all the necessary business rules? So example mapping is way more closely tied to testing than story mapping. Story mapping is really about understanding and how we can slice the stories. You can use them for looking at scenarios at a high level, but it's not really a testing kind of thing. Yes, so I imagine David had said, and I imagine this was in response to, I said a good developer will think of things. He mentioned a good tester will think of tests that are not specified in the story as requirements. Absolutely. PDU information is not me, it's the organizers. Cost benefits of tests. Adding too many tests that don't deliver value can slow down production for very little gain. Needs to be balanced. So what I will say on that is, when you're doing your regression suite and putting your automated tests into it, be careful. You do not need to put every test into the regression suite. You might do it while you're building the story, because then because you're adding functionality as you're building that story. But when you go to put it into the regression suite, maybe you take out some of those tests. Maybe you only need some of them to go into the production run to be running all the time. You can talk about that and decide which ones, because you're absolutely right. Too many tests that don't, and the key thing is, why are you building them if they're not delivering value? I would ask that first. Thank you. And thank you all for participating.